During the last months of World War II, the segregated U.S. Army partially integrated 24 rifle companies, and the results were huge. During the war, the U.S. military was segregated. This meant for the most part, black soldiers served in separate units from white soldiers. However, from March to April of 1945 until the end of the war in Europe, the U.S. Army carried out an experiment whereby it added a platoon of black soldiers to 24 rifle companies in 7 divisions. The 1st, 2nd, 9th, 69th, 78th, 99th, and 104th Infantry Divisions. There were an additional 4 divisions with black platoons not interviewed, including the 8th Infantry and 12th Armored. After VE Day in late May and early June 1945, they took a survey of the white officers and NCOs in those companies to gauge the feeling. This video goes question by question reporting their answers. It won't be a holistic video about race relations in the US military, that could probably be a whole channel. Rather, it's about one data point that showed how simple exposure to motivated black soldiers, even just being in the same division, dramatically changed minds. But first, who were the black soldiers in question? They all volunteered to be transferred to the infantry, after which they received 6 weeks of training at reinforcement depots, usually by the white officers or NCOs who would lead them into combat. Almost all came from the Corps of Engineers, Quartermaster Corps, and Transportation Corps, with fairly small portions from the Signal Corps, Ordnance Department, and other branches. 63% came from 6 occupations: light truck driver, duty soldier 3, longshoreman, basic, foreman construction, and cargo checker. So they were coming from rear echelon units, many in non-professions. As far as demographics, 90% of the black infantrymen in the experiment were below the age of 30 years old. 67 were from the South, including border states, compared to only 31% of white soldiers in their companies. Only 22% had graduated high school, compared to 41% of a cross-section of white riflemen in the ETO. As well, only 29% of them had Army General Classification test scores above Class 4, compared to 71% of white riflemen. Class 1 was the highest intelligence, while Class 5 was the lowest. The discrepancy in AGCT scores in general have been attributed to fewer educational, occupational, and social opportunities among the black population. As for who answered the survey questions, there were 250 respondents within the 24 test companies, including all white officers and a representative sample of white NCOs. The experiment was carried out by augmenting a company with 1 all-black rifle platoon, not including the white platoon commander and platoon sergeant. This was in addition to the TO&E of 1 company HQ, 3 rifle platoons, and 1 weapons platoon, which were all white. The number of augmented companies varied by division. Question 1. How did you feel at first about serving in a company that had white platoons and colored platoons? 64% of both officers and NCOs were relatively unfavorable, with qualitative responses like "I was skeptical," "I didn't like it," "I thought it caused trouble," and so on. Only 33% of officers and 35% of NCOs were relatively favorable, saying they'd be willing to try it, it made no difference, they didn't mind, etc. However, when asked, has your feeling changed since serving in the same unit with colored soldiers, 77% of both groups said they'd become more favorable towards them, that they felt more respect for them, or liked them better. Only 16% of officers and 21% of NCOs said their feeling was unchanged. There were no cases where an individual reported that their attitude had become less favorable. This was heavily influenced by their combat record. One platoon commander from Rhode Island stated, "A lot of boys from the South didn't like the idea at first, but a few days fighting along with them changed their minds." When asked, how well did the colored soldiers in this company perform in combat, 16 to 17% said fairly well, and 84 to 81% said very well. The only cited negative attribute of the black platoon was the men sometimes advancing too rapidly and too far in an attack. One company commander from Connecticut said, "They're very aggressive as fighters, really good at fighting in woods and close quarter work. The only trouble is getting them to stop. They just keep pushing." In other words, they had too much elan. The combat observer in 7 Corps, which at the time covered the 1st, 8th, 78th, and 104th Infantry Divisions, additionally commented that some combat difficulties arose from the inexperience of the NCOs and control of their squads. However, the black units were rated satisfactory in training and excellent in combat, with normal casualties compared to other units. The inexperienced NCO was certainly not a phenomenon limited to black units. Cited positive attributes included aggressiveness in the attack, effective use of firepower and teamwork, and adeptness at close-in fighting. A company commander from California reported, "They're the best platoon in the regiment. I wish I could get a presidential citation for them." Another from Virginia stated, "They have had real battle testing and have done well. You have to push them a lot. Lack of initiative and need a strong leader. Good on teamwork." This colored platoon of 35 men with no prepared positions was counterattacked by 90 Germans. The platoon commander had just been captured. They killed 46 and took 35 prisoners, without losing any ground or having any casualties. Some officers stressed that the fact that the soldiers were volunteers may have given them exceptional combat qualities. During the war, 61% of US service members were still draftees, so everyone volunteering to transfer from relatively safe rear echelon units to frontline combat units is significant. It was written by Brigadier General B.O. Davis Sr. in February of 1945 that many black soldiers wondered if changing their status from service troops to combat troops would bring them full enjoyment of American citizenship. A relatively high proportion of the black soldiers in the experiment were NCOs, and they actually had somewhat above average AGCT scores compared to other black troops. It was stated in the report that white officers sometimes overestimated the education level and AGCT scores of the black soldiers under their command. As well, in many cases, a unit's best white company and platoon commanders and platoon sergeants were specially picked for the duty, meaning some of the black platoons had above average leadership. As a result, the Army dismissed the experiment as untypical, as referenced in the Gillem report. All black units in general suffered from a high concentration of lower class 4 and 5 AGCT scores. Many black troops who underwent training in the South were also treated poorly, and had a subsequent drop in morale and patriotism. Maybe conscripting an ethnic minority with worse educational opportunities, squandering their manpower because of racist policies, not allowing segregated combat units to be properly prioritized with high performers as a result, and putting an anti-integration paternalist in command of those men was not a great policy regardless of how typical it was. Another factor mentioned was the test units for the most part did not conduct sustained attacks under intense heavy mortar or artillery fire, the implication being that the most severe combat conditions could have broken them. However, it was indicated that the performance of the colored troops was rated highest by the white officers and NCOs in companies that experienced severe fighting. As well, when asked, "How do you think colored troops compare with white troops as infantry soldiers have given the same Army training and experience?" 69% of officers and 83% of NCOs said they'd be the same. 17% and 9% even said better than white troops. It seems some of the better than responses were because the black soldiers under their command had a more servile attitude. One company commander from California said, "They're the best troops you'll find anywhere, and for my money, far superior to most white infantry. None of them ever got smart alecky. They just did their job and did damn well." And finally, the white soldiers accepted them on their own merits. Following orders is what the military is after all. On a personal level, respondents stated that their white and colored soldiers got along very or fairly well. Most friction came from white soldiers from outside of the test unit, and a supermajority believed it would be a good idea to have all black platoons in the same company as white soldiers, although very few believed that white and black soldiers in the same platoons was a good idea. The most common reason was to encourage friendly competition between the platoons, followed by avoiding friction that might come from having southern white soldiers in the same platoons as black soldiers, while also, quote, giving them the feeling of being with the white boys. In this way, having segregated platoons was framed as being the option that give black soldiers a feeling of participation, non-discrimination, and an able interracial understanding. It was all a little condescending, but this was the 1940s. My guess is that this could have been chalked up to a lack of imagination. In the military, there's an inherent bias towards the known. After all, the most popular integration option was what the units actually did. However, if the experiment included mixed platoons or even squads as well, perhaps there'd be more in favor of complete desegregation. In one company where the platoons were so under strength that a white squad had to be added to the black platoon, the white squad didn't want to go back, which is probably the greatest endorsement of all. A separate survey of 1,710 enlisted men in the ETO put an even finer point on how actual experience with integration resulted in more progressive opinions. The survey included 2 questions related to the experiment. First, some Army divisions have companies that include Negro and white platoons. How would you feel about it if your outfit was set up something like that? The main takeaway from this survey was the further soldiers were removed from the experiment, the less they liked the idea. Of the white EMs and units without mixed companies, 62% stated they dislike it very much if their own unit ran a similar setup, with 27% stating they would rather not but believed it wouldn't matter much. However, only 24% of those in the same division but not in the same regiment, and 20% of those in the same regiment stated as such. A division is somewhat proximal on the grand scheme, but on the ground not really. Meanwhile, only 7% of men who were in the same companies stated they disliked it, which is congruent with the feedback from the officers and NCOs. Secondly, in general, do you think it's a good idea or a poor idea to have the same company in a combat outfit include Negro platoons and white platoons? Only 18% of the white soldiers completely removed from the experiment said they thought it was a fairly good or very good idea, compared to 50% of soldiers in the same division but not regiment, 66% of soldiers in the same regiment but not company, and 64% of soldiers in the same company. A 2 percentage point difference with this small a sample isn't a significantly different number. As 31% of the white soldiers in the mixed companies were from the South, similar to the 34% of white respondents outside of the companies, and 2 of the divisions were predominantly Southern in background, geographical origin was not a factor in the different attitudes. It had entirely to do with white soldiers with actual exposure to black volunteers having their opinions shifted. Outside of the auspices of this study, the 12th Armored Division also received 12 black volunteer platoons and organized them as 3 companies, each attached to an armored infantry battalion. Their performance was characterized as very good by the division commander, with notable acts of individual heroism and no desertions. Combat Command and battalion commanders reported no friction between black and white troops, although they were more critical of their combat performance. Still, nothing systematically incongruent with the results in the infantry divisions.